Welcome to Lecture 4 in our course, History 311, Early Modern European History. And this module, we're dealing with one of the most interesting and rich periods of history in the last 300 years or so, and that's this era known as the Enlightenment. And we're trying to deal with where the Enlightenment came from in our discussion. And I'll let that discussion take place and not focus on it a whole lot here, but let me make a couple of generalizations, though, about this period. The first is that life is becoming a little more secure for certain groups of the population. That means they're getting richer. There's less religious warfare during the 18th century as well. There are better harvests and less hunger. The climate is actually warming. Earlier, the last couple of centuries, prior to the 18th century, the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, the northern hemisphere of the planet experienced what many historians refer to as the Little Ice Age. It was just a slight cooling of the climate, mostly in the northern hemisphere. This made life more difficult. It wasn't nearly as extreme as the warming in the climate we're getting over the last 40 or 50 years, and especially in the last 10 years. But it was still observable. So keep that in mind as well. The Enlightenment in general is a period of optimism. And what fuels the Enlightenment? Well, it was kind of an excitement about learning. It was sort of follow-up to some of Isaac Newton's discoveries, or the discovery, the recognition of a scientific method of testing your observations and thereby verifying what is right and what is wrong in the area of physics and science, right? And this excitement about learning begins to spread to the middle classes, you might say, or to the aristocracy, as it were, in France. And in France, it's carried on in the salons. This becomes the engine of the Enlightenment. Engine, something that's moving, something that's spreading. Salons were these private parties, often hosted by women and aristocratic women. But France was an unlikely place for the Enlightenment to flourish, because if you remember our conversation in the previous module, we talked about Louis XIV, the Sun King, and absolutism. How could it be that the Enlightenment was flourishing in one of the most absolutist places that you could find? Well, it did so behind closed doors, in these private spaces, in salons that were by invitation only. So no, you don't invite people that you might suspect of snitching at you to the government. You invite friends of the Enlightenment. And salons became these pretty, salons, the word has become a name for women's hair salons, right? But in France, it meant a private party. But like a women's hair salon as well, there was a similarity. And the similarity was that they were social hubs. And social hubs, centers of human interaction, communication, sociability, are really important in history. So the salons were places that people would show off their knowledge. They were parties. They got pretty crazy too. There were some salons that the more we move into the Enlightenment, they were having fun with learning. I think students sometimes get bogged down in education or have negative experiences when they were in high school, and they think that learning is actually drudgery. Learning should be actually the enlightened, the exact opposite. It should be enlightening, which should be fun, right? It should be the best kind of fulfillment. So a lot of these parties, though, in the salons got pretty crazy insofar of the themes of them. I've read that some of them You would come with your exotic. It would be an exotic perfume party, so you would come with different scents that you could show off, different wardrobe, poetry readings, music, anything to show off your not just knowledge, but your knowledgeable artistic abilities as well. So this is all done behind private doors in absolutist France. And in England, it actually took a more public turn, and the engines for the Enlightenment in England were in coffee houses. And if you remember as well, the trade routes at this time are beginning to boom, and this is also what is making the Enlightenment possible. It had to do with weather, better crops, spread of education, all these things, yes, but prosperity was also making this possible. So the flourishing of the economy around the Atlantic world is making the Enlightenment possible. The irony, of course, is that much of the profits that these new companies were bringing back to these colonial mother countries in France and England, even in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Prussia, in current day Germany, in Russia. These profits were coming home, especially in France and England, from the triangular trade, from the Royal African Company, for example, in England, the Dutch East India Company in the Netherlands, the Virginia Company for Britain and North America, but also by slave labor and the buying and selling of enslaved persons. That middle passage in the triangular trade around the Atlantic of human cargo, of chattel slavery, enslavement of people. So keep that in mind as well. It's a more prosperous century, but not everyone is benefiting equally, to say the least, from this booming economy. Now, the theme of the Enlightenment, though, is reason, reform, and the last of these that I like to emphasize is freedom. What do they like to debate in these debating societies in London coffee houses? Well, they like to discuss things like what is the definition of freedom, or how can one live a free life? And this enter onto the screen people like John Locke and the idea of natural rights. People and John Locke's idea, enshrined in our own Declaration of Independence, is that all people are born free, and it's just as we grow older in life that our parents, our families, and then states and institutions take our freedom away from us. We're all born, as he said, a tabula rasa, a blank slate to be written on, and we're all free at that point. And unfortunately, we're then put in chains. Mostly, he's talking about more metaphorical chains, but he introduces this powerful idea that is, as I said, enshrined in our own Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all, it's a Declaration of Men of Independence says all men are created equal, but insert men for whatever group or humankind you could replace it with. That's a powerful thing, that we all are created equal and endowed by our Creator by certain inalienable rights. The group that was most responsible for this kind of thinking, popularizing it, would be known as deists. Deists believe in a rational universe, and they believe that people too, like the universe, should be rational as well. This is, after all, the age of reason. So just as we have natural laws that rule the universe, as Isaac Newton pointed out, so too There are natural rights for human beings, and human beings are basically rational creatures. Um, you can see this Enlightenment ethos, the ethic of the Enlightenment as well in other figures in France and in other countries as well, such as Denis Diderot and his obsession with trying to catalog all of the knowledge, useful knowledge in the world in what he calls his encyclopedia. This is a new idea. And the encyclopedia wasn't just like our encyclopedias, like the World Book Britannia or any of the other big world encyclopedias that you can look at online today or browse in the library with huge compendiums of information that they are. Denis Diderot also wanted to make them practical. He wanted to make them almost like manuals. You want to learn how to do something? Well, you can look it up in the encyclopedia. Cooking, how to be a stonemason, you name it. All this knowledge would also be shared. It would be a practical thing. Also, if you this is where you also started to get into trouble with the authorities as well, because if you wanted to learn about other ways of governance around the world, you can look it up, or other religions. Knowledge about other religions. Why would anybody need anything like that? This is why the church opposes the publication of Denis Diderot's encyclopedia. The absolutist state under Louis the 15th and then Louis the 16th will also oppose its publication. But the idea was that if we can just get knowledge into people's minds, then we can transform the world. Okay. The other thing that I want to emphasize about the Enlightenment is the development of a new art form known as the sorry about that. Known as the novel. The novel. Some say that Robinson Crusoe, written by Daniel Defoe, is the first novel in English to be written, but this is a different type of art form. It's largely an art form where you're inside the head of a narrator, right? You hear his interior thoughts. It's sometimes in English departments called an interior monologue, right? You know, I'm thinking right now that I'm giving a lecture and I'm thinking, whoa, you know, I'm inside my head, right? As if I were a narrator in a novel, I'd be explaining not just what I'm saying, but what I'm thinking at the same time. Don't worry, I'm thinking very positive thoughts. So it's okay if you imagine what I'm thinking because it's very positive, right? I'm trying to put a positive spin and be funny at the same time, a little bit ironic, perhaps. Novels were ambitious because they sought to uncover the ways in which we as individuals tick, right? And that is very indicative of this age of the Enlightenment. It was a very individualistic age, right? People, reading itself is a very individualistic kind of pastime, right? Well, sure, you might have book groups and coffee houses where you discuss books, discuss what you're reading, but reading and writing themselves as acts are things that you do in private. And people are increasingly doing this. They're writing diaries. This is the age of letter writing. And it's quite natural in a way for them to write novels as well, because the first novels at this time are actually written in epistolary form. And that means in letter form. They're exchanges of letters because people bore their souls out in these letters, in these epistles that they sent. And they're sending and writing letters and expressing themselves because they have at this time a more reliable, postal system as well. So people are learning to read and write more, literacy, because that's seen as a way of getting on. If you're middle class, if you want to get on in business, you have to learn to read and write. But they weren't just reading and writing account books. They were also reading and writing letters. And then a few artists began saying, we can make really fun kind of artistic expressions out of letters and paste them all together. And they'll tell these sometimes very romantic stories. In the story of Robinson Crusoe, you have the story of a person who is marooned on a desert island and then has to figure out how to survive there, and he becomes a very individualistic, successful person. He realizes that he doesn't really need society at all. He kind of is an island himself. Yeah, I have in the past had students read the entire novel of Robinson Crusoe. This semester we'll only be reading the one novel, Frankenstein, at the end of the class, so we will get an example then of being up inside the heads of narrators of novels, and we'll understand that art form a bit better with Mary Frankenstein. The last thing I want to point out in this module, and you read about this a lot about this in your textbook, are the various enlightened monarchs that rule. Monarchs, kings and queens, sometimes embraced the Enlightenment, but they weren't so much for the reforms of sort of constitutional monarchy, which now they had in Great Britain in greater expression. Monarchs latched on to the idea of efficiency, of reforming their states and their state bureaucracies, and even expanding their bureaucracies to become more efficient, learn how to collect taxes better, make improvements to the military, increase education, not public education really yet, but education for people who want to serve in the state or to have important jobs in the military. They have to have a good education, so they started pouring money into education. Peter the Great, you'll read about him in Russia, will become a czar as well, that will become very enamored with Western ideas during the Enlightenment. He sends out a famous expedition to Western Europe to find out, how are they building all these ships that sail around this triangular trade route? What's the British Navy like? What is their tax collection like? What are these things called coffee houses? But he doesn't want any free expression, right? He just wants to adopt measures that will make himself strong. Okay, you can read all of that about that in the chapter this week and much more. You can read about the Spanish Wars of Succession and even the 7 Years' War, or what's called the French and Indian War in this part of the world. So I look forward to our discussion this week on the Enlightenment, and we'll also be discussing Montesquieu and what are known as the Persian Letters, which is, again, one of these early novels. And specifically, we'll be reading a couple of the letters from the Persian Letters, the parable of the troglodytes. All right? I'll see you online. Thanks for watching and listening. 18 minutes. Stop taking video.